Sarah Martinez had always believed that hard work and dedication would be enough. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with determined brown eyes and calloused hands from years of military service, she embodied everything the Army claimed to value. But on that cold February morning in 2019, as she stared at the discharge papers spread across the metal desk in front of her, she realized that sometimes even your best wasn't good enough for the system you'd sworn to serve. The fluorescent lights in the administrative office buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the 3 officers sitting across from her. Colonel Peterson, a stern man with graying temples, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Sergeant Martinez, after careful review of your performance over the past 18 months, we've determined that your continued service is not in the best interest of this unit or the United States Army. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the papers, her mind racing to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Just 2 years ago, she had been one of the most promising non-commissioned officers in the 4th Infantry Division. Her superiors had praised her tactical thinking, her ability to connect with soldiers under her command, and her unwavering commitment to the mission. Now, those same qualities were being twisted and used against her. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning in her stomach. "My soldiers have consistently met all training standards. Our readiness reports have been exemplary. I've never failed a fitness test or received any disciplinary action." Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, a woman Sarah had once looked up to as a mentor, leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine regret in her eyes. "Sarah, this isn't about your technical competence. It's about fit. Your methods are unconventional. You question orders that come down from above. You've been reported multiple times for insubordination." Insubordination. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I asked questions about training procedures that weren't working. I suggested modifications based on what I observed in the field. Isn't that what leaders are supposed to do?" The 3rd officer, Major Thompson, shuffled through a thick file folder. "You publicly contradicted Captain Williams during the field exercise last month. You undermined his authority in front of junior enlisted personnel." Sarah's jaw tightened. She remembered that exercise vividly. Captain Williams had ordered her squad to advance across an open field without proper reconnaissance, a move that would have been suicidal in real combat. She had respectfully suggested an alternative route that would provide better cover and concealment. When Williams insisted on the original plan, she had quietly explained to her soldiers why they needed to be extra vigilant and what to watch for. Not one of them had been killed in the simulation, while other squads following Williams' orders had suffered heavy casualties. "I kept my soldiers alive," she said simply. Colonel Peterson's expression hardened. "You defied a direct order from a superior officer. In combat, that kind of behavior gets people killed." "In combat, bad orders get people killed," Sarah shot back, then immediately regretted her tone. She took a deep breath and tried again. "Sir, I understand the importance of the chain of command. But I also understand that my first responsibility is to my soldiers. If I see a better way to accomplish the mission while keeping them safe, isn't it my duty to speak up?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of drill instructors shouting commands on the parade ground outside. She realized in that moment that she had just proven their point, at least in their minds. They saw her dedication to her soldiers as a weakness, her willingness to think independently as a threat to order and discipline. Davidson's voice was gentler when she spoke again. "Sarah, you're a good soldier. No one questions your heart or your intentions. But the Army is built on trust, trust that orders will be followed, that the chain of command will be respected. When that breaks down, everything breaks down. But what about trust in leaders to make good decisions?" Sarah asked. "What about trust that someone will speak up when they see a problem?" Thompson closed the file folder with a sharp snap. "The decision has been made, Sergeant Martinez. You'll be processed for administrative discharge under honorable conditions. Your service record will reflect your completion of duty, and you'll retain all veterans' benefits." Honorable conditions. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind as she walked across the base later that day, carrying a cardboard box containing 8 years of her life. Photos with her soldiers, commendations for excellence in training, certificates from leadership courses she had excelled in, all reduced to items in a box that barely weighed 10 pounds. The worst part wasn't the discharge itself. It was the whispers that had started weeks before, when word began to spread that she was being investigated. Other NCOs avoided her in the mess hall. Soldiers she had trained and Minturd looked away when she passed. The rumor mill had branded her as a troublemaker, someone who couldn't hack it, someone who put her own opinions above the good of the unit. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the few friends who still spoke to her, found her sitting alone on a bench near the motor pool as the sun set behind the barracks. "This is bull, Sarah, and you know it," he said, settling down beside her. "Is it?" Sarah stared at her hands, noting the small scars from years of weapons maintenance and field training. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't fit. You saved Johnson's life during that training accident last year. You spotted the mechanical failure that could have killed half a dozen people. You developed that new PT program that increased our unit's fitness scores by 30%. How is any of that not fitting in?" Sarah appreciated his loyalty, but she could see the situation more clearly now. "I made enemies, Rodriguez. I questioned too many decisions. I made people uncomfortable. You made people think," he corrected. "And some people don't like to think." As the weeks passed and Sarah transitioned to civilian life, the full weight of her situation became clear. She had entered the Army straight out of high school, building her entire adult identity around service and leadership. Now, at 26, she found herself in a small apartment outside Fort Carson, Colorado, with no clear direction and a growing sense that everything she had believed about merit and dedication had been wrong. The job search was brutal. Her resume was strong on paper: 8 years of leadership experience, multiple commendations, expertise in logistics, and personnel management. But every interview seemed to go the same way. Employers would be impressed initially, then ask probing questions about why she had left the military. When she tried to explain that she had been discharged for being too independent, too willing to speak up, she could see their interest evaporate. "We need team players here," one hiring manager told her. "People who can follow direction and work within established systems." Another was more direct. "Military discharge can mean a lot of things. We need to know you can take direction from civilian supervisors." Sarah began to understand that the label of failure would follow her into every aspect of her new life. The Army's assessment of her character had become a scarlet letter that she couldn't remove. Former colleagues who had praised her leadership skills now viewed her as damaged goods. Her confidence, built over years of successful service, began to crumble. The financial pressure mounted quickly. The GI Bill would help with education, but she needed income immediately. She took a job at a warehouse distribution center, loading trucks for minimum wage. The supervisor, a former Navy petty officer named Jim Walsh, treated her with barely concealed contempt. "I don't care what you did in the Army," he told her on the first day. "Here, you follow my orders without question. No suggestions, no improvements, no thinking outside the box. You load the trucks the way I tell you, when I tell you." It was a deliberate humiliation, and Sarah knew it. Walsh had clearly heard about her discharge and was determined to put her in her place. She bit her tongue and focused on the work, telling herself that this was temporary, that she would find something better. But better opportunities didn't come. Months passed, and Sarah found herself trapped in a cycle of rejection and doubt. She applied for management trainee positions, using her military experience to highlight her leadership skills, only to be told she was overqualified or not the right fit. She tried for entry-level positions in her areas of expertise, only to be beaten out by candidates who didn't carry the stigma of military discharge. The isolation was perhaps worse than the professional rejection. Sarah had always been social, someone who thrived on the camaraderie and shared purpose of military life. Now she spent her days alone, performing mindless physical labor, then returning to an empty apartment where the silence seemed to amplify every doubt and regret. She tried to stay connected with former colleagues, but those relationships gradually faded. People moved on to new assignments, new challenges, new lives. The bonds forged in service, which had seemed unbreakable, proved fragile when tested by distance and circumstances. Sarah began to wonder if those friendships had been based more on shared circumstances than genuine connection. The darkest moment came 6 months after her discharge, when she learned that Captain Williams had been promoted to major. The same officer whose poor judgment she had questioned, whose orders would have resulted in unnecessary casualties, was moving up the ranks while she struggled to find meaningful work. It seemed like final proof that the system rewarded conformity over competence, politics over performance. Sarah sat in her apartment that night, staring at the commendations and photos from her military service, and seriously considered throwing them all away. What was the point of keeping reminders of a career that had ended in failure? What value did her achievements have if they had led to disgrace? But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride or stubbornness, or simply the ingrained discipline that 8 years of military service had instilled in her. She couldn't bring herself to discard the evidence of who she had been, even if the world seemed determined to forget. Instead, she carefully packed the items in a box and placed them in her closet. Not thrown away, but not displayed either. Hidden, like the part of herself that had once believed leadership meant caring more about doing the right thing than following orders. As winter turned to spring, Sarah established a routine that helped her cope with the disappointment and uncertainty. She woke early, maintained the physical fitness standards she had followed in the army, and spent her days at the warehouse trying not to think about the future. In the evenings, she read voraciously. Military history, leadership theory, anything that might help her understand where she had gone wrong or how she might rebuild. The reading didn't provide easy answers, but it did offer perspective. She learned about other leaders who had been dismissed or court-martialed for challenging conventional wisdom, only to be vindicated by history. She read about the costs of blind obedience and the value of moral courage. Slowly, she began to understand that her discharge might say more about the institution than it did about her. But understanding didn't pay the bills or restore her reputation. As her first year as a civilian stretched on, Sarah felt herself changing in ways that worried her. The confident leader who had once inspired soldiers and improved systems was becoming withdrawn and bitter. She caught herself snapping at coworkers over minor issues, avoiding social situations, and dwelling on grievances that served no productive purpose. The transformation frightened her more than the professional setbacks. She had always prided herself on being solution-oriented, someone who focused on what could be done rather than what had gone wrong. Now she found herself trapped in cycles of resentment and self-doubt that seemed to feed on themselves. It was during this period of internal struggle that Sarah first heard about the crisis that was brewing with her old unit. Rodriguez called her on a Thursday evening, his voice tense with concern. "Sarah, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need to ask you something. Do you remember that logistics system you designed for tracking equipment and personnel?" "Of course," she replied, surprised by the question. "Why?" "Because everything's falling apart here, and I think your system might be the only thing that can fix it." Sarah felt a familiar stirring, the same mixture of excitement and determination that had once driven her to excel as a leader. For the first time in months, someone was asking for her expertise rather than questioning her judgment. But she also felt the weight of everything that had happened, the knowledge that her willingness to help had been twisted against her before. "Rodriguez, I'm not in the army anymore. Whatever's happening there, it's not my problem." "I know," he said quietly. "But these are still your soldiers, Sarah. The people you trained, the systems you built, they're falling apart without someone who understands how they really work." The conversation ended without resolution, but it planted a seed that Sarah couldn't ignore. Over the following days, she found herself thinking about her old unit, wondering what kind of crisis could be serious enough for Rodriguez to reach out to someone who had been branded a failure. She told herself it wasn't her concern anymore. She had been cast out, labeled as someone who couldn't work within the system. Whatever problems they were facing, they would have to solve them without her unconventional methods and insubordinate questions. But even as she tried to push the thoughts away, Sarah felt something awakening inside her, a sense of purpose that had been dormant since her discharge. For better or worse, those soldiers had been her responsibility once. If they were in trouble, could she really turn her back on them? The answer to that question would define not just her future, but her understanding of what true leadership really meant. The phone call from Rodriguez had awakened something in Sarah that she thought had been buried forever. For 3 days after their conversation, she found herself distracted at work, her mind wandering back to the soldiers she had once led and the systems she had helped create. The warehouse supervisor noticed her lack of focus and made increasingly sharp comments about her performance, but Sarah barely heard him. Her thoughts were consumed by questions about what kind of crisis could be serious enough to prompt her former colleague to reach out to someone the Army had branded a failure. She got her answer on a Sunday morning when Rodriguez called again, this time with panic evident in his voice. "Sarah, you need to see the news. Turn on Channel 7. Sarah fumbled for the remote control, her heart racing as she switched to the local news station. The lead story made her blood run cold. Military training exercise goes wrong. 3 soldiers hospitalized. Investigation launched. The reporter, standing outside the gates of Fort Carson, delivered the details with professional detachment. What was supposed to be a routine training exercise turned into a medical emergency yesterday when 3 soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division were rushed to the hospital with severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. 2 remain in intensive care this morning. Base officials have launched a full investigation into what went wrong during the exercise, which was part of a new training protocol implemented 6 months ago. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Rodriguez answered on the first ring. "Tell me those weren't our people," she said, though she already knew the answer from his silence. Martinez, Patel, and Chun. Rodriguez's voice was heavy with grief. Martinez is still unconscious. The doctors aren't sure about brain damage yet. Sarah sank onto her couch, feeling the weight of responsibility even though she had been gone for almost a year. Private Martinez was only 19, a kid from Texas who had reminded her of her younger brother. She had personally recommended him for advanced training because of his dedication and potential. "What happened?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The new training protocol," Rodriguez explained bitterly. "After you left, Major Williams now, decided that our training wasn't aggressive enough. He implemented a new system that pushes people harder, faster. No breaks, no modifications for weather conditions, no allowances for individual physical limitations." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the countless arguments she had had with Captain Williams about the importance of adaptive training programs. She had developed protocols that pushed soldiers to their limits while still maintaining safety margins, systems that took into account individual fitness levels, weather conditions, and medical histories. Williams had always complained that her methods were too soft, too individualized. "What about the hydration protocols I established? The heat injury prevention measures?" "Scrapped," Rodriguez said. "Williams said they showed weakness, that real combat doesn't allow for water breaks every hour. He instituted a new policy. Soldiers get water at designated intervals only, regardless of temperature or exertion level." Sarah felt sick. She remembered the research she had done on heat injuries, the careful calculations she had made to develop hydration schedules that would maintain peak performance while preventing medical emergencies. The Army had detailed medical data showing that proper hydration actually improved combat effectiveness, but Williams had apparently decided that ideology was more important than science. "Rodriguez, please tell me someone challenged this. Please tell me the medical officer spoke up." "Doc Harrison tried," Rodriguez replied. "Williams had him reassigned. Said he was undermining unit readiness with his excessive caution." The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of systematic dismantling of everything Sarah had worked to build. She had spent years developing training protocols based on the latest research in human performance, systems that had resulted in higher fitness scores, fewer injuries, and better overall readiness. Now, in the pursuit of appearing tougher, Williams had thrown away proven methods in favor of an approach that had nearly killed 3 soldiers. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "The logistics system you designed for tracking equipment and personnel? They replaced it with a simplified version that doesn't account for individual qualifications or equipment compatibility. We've had 3 major equipment failures in the past month because people weren't properly trained on the systems they were assigned to operate." Sarah stood up and began pacing her small apartment, her mind racing through the implications. The logistics system she had created wasn't just about efficiency, it was about safety. Making sure that soldiers were only assigned to operate equipment they were properly trained on, ensuring that maintenance schedules were followed, tracking wear patterns to prevent catastrophic failures. It had taken her 2 years to develop and had been praised by higher command as a model for other units. Why would they scrap something that was working? "Because it was your system," Rodriguez said bluntly. "After your discharge, Williams made it clear that anything associated with your leadership style was a liability. He called it cleaning house and establishing proper military discipline." The vindictiveness of it shocked Sarah, even though she should have been prepared for it. She had seen similar patterns before, new leaders who felt compelled to dismantle their predecessors' achievements to establish their own authority. But she had never imagined that personal animosity would override concern for soldier safety. What about Lieutenant Davidson? Isn't she still the XO? Surely she wouldn't allow this. Rodriguez's laugh was bitter. Davidson transferred out 6 months ago. Apparently, she and Williams had some major disagreements about training policy. Her replacement is fresh out of officer basic course, and Williams has made it clear that questioning his methods is career suicide. Sarah sat back down, overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster. In less than a year, Williams had systematically destroyed protocols that had taken years to develop and perfect. Worse, he had done it in a way that eliminated anyone who might challenge his methods or point out their flaws. Rodriguez, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm a civilian now. I have no authority, no access to the base. Even if I wanted to help, how could I? I don't know, he admitted. But I know that 3 good soldiers are in the hospital because we threw away everything you taught us. And I know that more are going to get hurt if something doesn't change. After Rodriguez hung up, Sarah found herself staring at the closet where she had stored her military memorabilia. For the first time in months, she pulled out the box and carefully examined its contents. Her commendations for excellence in training development, photos of soldiers who had thrived under her leadership, copies of the protocols and systems she had created. She pulled out a thick binder labeled Training Safety Protocols and began reading through the detailed procedures she had developed. Every page represented hours of research, consultation with medical experts, and real-world testing. The hydration schedules alone had been refined through dozens of iterations, each one designed to balance peak performance with medical safety. As she read, Sarah felt a growing sense of anger, not just at Williams, but at a system that allowed personal grievances to override scientific evidence and soldier welfare. She had been branded a failure and pushed out of the army for questioning methods that were genuinely dangerous. Now those same dangerous methods had put 3 soldiers in the hospital. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to her warehouse job and drove to the base. She couldn't get past the gate without military ID, but she positioned herself at a coffee shop across the street where she could observe the comings and goings. She told herself she was just gathering information, trying to understand the full scope of the crisis. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The soldiers she observed looked stressed and exhausted. Their movements lacked the confident precision she remembered, replaced by a tense wariness that suggested chronic fear of making mistakes. Even from a distance, she could see the signs of a unit under severe strain. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Heard you were in the area. We need to talk. D. Harrison, Major, Medical Corps. Sarah stared at the message, trying to place the name. Then, she remembered Doc Harrison, the medical officer that Williams had reassigned for challenging the new training protocols. Somehow he had heard about her presence and wanted to meet. They arranged to meet at a diner 20 miles from the base, far enough away to avoid any chance encounters with active duty personnel. Harrison arrived first, and Sarah recognized him immediately despite not having worked with him directly. He was a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and the perpetually concerned expression common to military medical officers who took their responsibilities seriously. Ms. Martinez, he said, standing as she approached his table. Thank you for coming. I know this is irregular, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Sarah sat down across from him, studying his face. Doctor, I'm not sure what you think I can do. I'm a civilian now. Whatever problems exist on base, they're not my responsibility anymore. Harrison's expression was grim. With respect, ma'am, you're wrong about that. The problems on base exist because your solutions were deliberately dismantled. And unless someone with your expertise intervenes, more soldiers are going to be seriously injured or killed. Doctor, even if that's true, I don't have any authority to intervene. I can't just walk onto a military base and start giving orders. No, Harrison agreed. But you can provide evidence. You can document what the proper protocols should be. You can give us ammunition to fight back against policies that are putting soldiers at risk. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the request. What exactly are you asking me to do? Harrison pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it on the table between them. I've been documenting everything since I was reassigned. Training injuries, equipment failures, medical incidents. The pattern is clear. Every change Williams has made has resulted in decreased safety and readiness. But I need expert testimony to make the case compelling enough to force higher command to act. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. The statistics were damning. Training injuries up 300%, equipment failures up 150%, soldier retention down 40%. But more important than the numbers were the individual case studies Harrison had compiled. Soldiers suffering stress fractures because Williams had eliminated recovery time between training events. Equipment operators making dangerous mistakes because they hadn't received proper familiarization training. Medical emergencies because hydration and rest protocols had been abandoned. This is comprehensive, Sarah said, impressed despite herself by the thoroughness of Harrison's documentation. But why haven't you taken this up the chain of command yourself? I tried, Harrison replied. My new commanding officer made it clear that any criticism of Williams' methods would be treated as insubordination. Apparently, higher command sees Williams as a rising star, someone who's modernizing training approaches. Sarah understood. She had experienced the same dynamic. When someone in authority decided you were a problem, the system closed ranks against you regardless of the merits of your concerns. Doctor, even if I agree to help, what makes you think anyone will listen to me? I was discharged for the same kinds of concerns you're raising now. Harrison leaned forward, his expression intense. Because you're not in the chain of command anymore. You can speak publicly about these issues without fear of retaliation. And because your original protocols are documented and proven, they can't dismiss your expertise as easily when it comes from outside the system. As Sarah continued reading through Harrison's files, she began to see a strategy forming. The original safety protocols she had developed were still on file, along with the research and justification that supported them. If she could demonstrate that Williams' changes directly contradicted established best practices, it might be possible to force a review of his policies. But it would also mean exposing herself to renewed scrutiny and criticism. Taking on Williams and the Army bureaucracy would likely close off any remaining possibilities for returning to military service. It would also require her to publicly relive the circumstances of her discharge. Doctor, I need time to think about this. What you're asking isn't just about helping soldiers. It's about taking on the entire system that branded me a failure in the first place. Harrison nodded. I understand. But I also want you to know that there are people who remember your leadership, who know that your discharge was wrong. Rodriguez isn't the only one who thinks you were treated unfairly. Sarah closed the folder and stood up. Give me 48 hours. If I decide to help, I'll need complete access to your documentation and a guarantee that any testimony I provide will be delivered to the right people. You have it, Harrison said immediately. Driving home, Sarah felt the familiar surge of purpose that had been absent since her discharge. For the first time in almost a year, someone was asking for her expertise rather than questioning her judgment. But she also felt the weight of responsibility. If she agreed to help, she would be putting herself squarely in conflict with the same institutional forces that had already destroyed her career once. That evening, she called her parents in Arizona to discuss the situation. Her father, a retired police officer who had always supported her military service, listened carefully as she explained the circumstances. Mija, he said when she finished, you've never been able to walk away from people who needed your help. That's what made you a good leader, and it's what got you in trouble. The question isn't whether you should help. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't. Her mother was more practical. Sarah, you've just started to build a new life. Are you sure you want to risk everything to fight a battle you might not be able to win? Both perspectives had merit, and Sarah spent a sleepless night weighing her options. She could walk away, focus on building her civilian career, and try to forget about the soldiers who were being put at risk by policies she knew were dangerous. Or she could wade back into the fight, knowing that it would likely cost her any chance of moving forward quietly. By dawn, she had made her decision. She thought about Private Martinez, still unconscious in the hospital, and realized that her father was right. She had never been able to walk away from people who needed her help, even when helping them came at personal cost. She picked up her phone and sent Harrison a simple text. I'm in. Sarah's decision to help Dr. Harrison marked the beginning of the most intense period of her civilian life. What started as a simple agreement to provide expert testimony quickly evolved into a comprehensive investigation that would consume every spare moment she had. The warehouse job that had once felt like a dead end became a blessing in disguise. Its mindless physical requirements left her mental energy free to focus on the real work she was doing in the evenings. The first challenge was establishing a secure communication network. Harrison had made it clear that Williams had allies throughout the command structure who would view any criticism of his methods as an attack on the unit's reputation. Sarah suggested they use encrypted messaging apps and meet only at locations well away from the base. She also insisted that they document everything, every conversation, every piece of evidence, every source of information. We're going to get one chance at this, she told Harrison during their second meeting. If we're going to challenge Williams and his policies, our case has to be bulletproof. Any mistakes or gaps in our evidence will be used to discredit everything we're saying. Harrison had brought along two other people to this meeting. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a medic who had been transferred out of the unit for questioning Williams' training protocols, and Sergeant First Class Kevin Park, a logistics specialist who had been demoted for refusing to implement equipment assignments that violated safety standards. Sarah studied the three faces across the table and saw reflections of her own experience. Competent professionals who had been marginalized for prioritizing soldier welfare over blind obedience to questionable orders. Their willingness to risk their careers to expose dangerous practices gave her confidence that they were doing the right thing, but it also highlighted the personal stakes involved. Before we go any further, Sarah said, I need everyone to understand what we're really doing here. We're not just challenging Williams' policies. We're challenging a system that punishes people for speaking up about safety concerns. Each of you has already paid a professional price for raising these issues. If we move forward, that price might get higher. Santos, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and prematurely lined face, spoke first. Ma'am, I've been a medic for 12 years. I've seen training injuries before, but nothing like what's happening now. These aren't accidents. They're predictable results of policies that ignore basic medical science. Park nodded in agreement. The equipment failures we're seeing aren't random either. When you assign people to operate systems they haven't been properly trained on, when you ignore maintenance schedules to increase operational tempo, failures are inevitable. Sarah appreciated their commitment, but she needed to make sure they understood the broader implications of what they were attempting. Here's what's going to happen when we present this evidence. Williams and his supporters are going to attack our credibility, our motives, and our loyalty. They're going to say we're disgruntled former employees trying to damage the unit's reputation. They're going to question why we didn't use proper channels to address our concerns. We did use proper channels, Harrison protested. I filed formal reports about the increase in training injuries. Park documented the equipment failures. Santos submitted medical recommendations that were ignored. I know, Sarah replied. But they're going to argue that we should have pushed harder through official channels before going outside the system. They're going to say that our decision to involve a discharged soldier proves that we're more interested in vindication than soldier safety. The group fell silent as they contemplated the challenges ahead. Sarah could see doubt creeping into their expressions, and she understood their hesitation. What they were proposing wasn't just professionally risky. It was essentially a form of institutional rebellion. Look, she continued, I'm not trying to talk you out of this. I believe Williams' policies are putting soldiers at unnecessary risk, and I think we have an obligation to expose that. But I also think we need to go into this with our eyes open about what we're really doing. Over the following weeks, the four of them worked to build a comprehensive case against Williams' training and logistics policies. Sarah took the lead in developing the technical arguments, drawing on her extensive research into training methodology and safety protocols. She compiled data from military medical literature, civilian sports science research, and historical studies of training injuries to demonstrate that Williams' approaches violated established best practices. The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Sarah found herself staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, cross-referencing medical studies and military regulations, building detailed charts that showed the correlation between policy changes and increased injury rates. She created side-by-side comparisons of her original protocols and Williams' modifications, highlighting how each change had eliminated critical safety measures. Harrison provided the medical perspective, documenting not just the increase in injuries, but the types of injuries that were occurring. He showed that the heat exhaustion cases that had hospitalized 3 soldiers were entirely preventable. They had occurred during moderate weather conditions that should never have posed a risk to properly hydrated personnel. Santos contributed detailed incident reports that painted a disturbing picture of medical concerns being systematically ignored. She documented cases where soldiers had been ordered to continue training despite showing early signs of heat exhaustion, where rest and recovery protocols had been abbreviated against medical advice, where pain medications had been used to mask injuries rather than allowing proper healing time. Park's contribution was perhaps the most damning of all. He had meticulously tracked equipment failures and traced each one back to specific policy violations. Vehicles breaking down because maintenance schedules had been shortened to increase training time. Communications equipment failing because operators hadn't received proper familiarization training. Weapons malfunctions because cleaning and inspection protocols had been streamlined beyond safe limits. As the evidence accumulated, Sarah began to see patterns that went beyond simple policy disagreements. Williams wasn't just implementing different training methods. He was systematically dismantling institutional knowledge and replacing proven practices with approaches that prioritized appearance over effectiveness. It's not really about soldier readiness, she told the group during one of their weekly meetings. It's about Williams' career advancement. He's trying to build a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense leader who gets results regardless of obstacles. But he's not getting results, Park pointed out. Readiness scores are down across the board. Sarah nodded. That's the real tragedy here. He's not just putting soldiers at risk, he's actually making the unit less effective. But he's packaging these failures in a way that makes them look like evidence of his demanding leadership style. Worse, he had created a climate where questioning his methods was treated as disloyalty, ensuring that problems would fester rather than being addressed. Sarah's analysis revealed another disturbing trend. Williams was actively driving away the unit's most competent personnel. Experienced NCOs and officers who challenged his methods found themselves transferred, demoted, or pushed toward early retirement. What remained was a command structure dominated by people who were either too inexperienced to recognize the problems or too intimidated to speak up about them. He's hollowing out institutional competence, Sarah explained to Harrison during one of their private conversations. In 5 years, this unit will be completely dependent on his personal leadership because he's eliminated everyone who might be able to function independently. The personal cost of their investigation was becoming apparent to all of them. Santos reported that she was being subjected to increased scrutiny from her new supervisors, with her performance being questioned despite exemplary service records. Park had been passed over for a promotion that he should have received automatically, with no explanation provided. Harrison had been assigned to administrative duties that kept him away from any direct patient care. For Sarah, the cost was different, but equally real. The time and energy she was devoting to the investigation left little room for building her civilian career. She had turned down opportunities for overtime at the warehouse and declined social invitations that might have helped her establish connections in her new community. She was essentially putting her life on hold to fight a battle that might ultimately be unwinnable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rodriguez called Sarah one evening with news that changed everything about their investigation. "Sarah, you need to know that word is getting out about what you're doing," he said, his voice tense with concern. "Williams knows you're gathering evidence against him." Sarah felt her stomach drop. How could he know? "We've been careful about operational security." "Someone talked," Rodriguez replied. "I don't know who, but Williams called a special formation today and made it clear that anyone caught cooperating with outside agitators would face serious consequences." The news was devastating but not entirely surprising. Sarah had always known that their investigation would eventually be discovered. Too many people were involved, and the evidence they were gathering was too comprehensive to remain secret indefinitely. "Rodriguez, this changes everything. If Williams knows what we're doing, he's going to take steps to protect himself. He might even accelerate some of his more dangerous policies to create facts on the ground before we can expose them." "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "Williams is putting together his own investigation. He's claiming that disgruntled former personnel are trying to sabotage unit readiness by spreading false information about training policies." Sarah realized that Williams was employing a classic institutional defense strategy, preemptively attacking the credibility of his critics before they could present their evidence. By framing their investigation as sabotage rather than legitimate concern for soldier welfare, he was positioning himself as the victim of a malicious campaign. "Rodriguez, I need you to be very careful about any further contact with us. Williams is obviously looking for someone to make an example of, and you can't afford to give him that opportunity." After hanging up, Sarah immediately contacted Harrison, Santos, and Park to inform them of the new developments. The group met the following evening at a restaurant 40 miles from the base to discuss their options. "We're at a decision point," Sarah told them. "Williams knows what we're doing, which means we've lost the element of surprise. We can either accelerate our timeline and present what we have now, or we can abandon the investigation before anyone faces serious retaliation." Harrison was adamant about moving forward. "We have enough evidence to make a compelling case. If we wait, Williams will have time to cover his tracks or transfer people who might corroborate our findings." Santos agreed. "Ma'am, soldiers are still getting hurt under these policies. Every day we delay means more unnecessary injuries." Park was more cautious. "What if Williams' investigation discredits us before we can present our case? What if he convinces higher command that we're acting out of personal grievance rather than legitimate concern?" Sarah had been wrestling with the same question. The challenge wasn't just presenting evidence. It was presenting it to an audience that was predisposed to distrust the messengers. Military institutions were inherently conservative, resistant to criticism from outsiders, and suspicious of personnel who challenged established authority. We need allies inside the system, she concluded. People with credibility who can present our evidence without being dismissed as disgruntled former employees. The solution came from Harrison, who revealed that he had been in contact with Colonel Rebecca Torres, the base medical officer and a respected authority on training safety. Torres had been growing increasingly concerned about the rise in training injuries, but had been unable to get Williams to modify his policies through normal channels. Colonel Torres has the rank and reputation to demand a formal investigation, Harrison explained. If we can provide her with enough evidence to justify her concerns, she can force higher command to take action. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Torres was exactly the kind of ally they needed, someone with impeccable credentials, institutional authority, and a legitimate medical concern about Williams' policies. But approaching Torres would require them to reveal their entire investigation, including Sarah's role in developing the evidence. It would mean trusting their carefully compiled case to someone they didn't know, someone who might decide that institutional loyalty outweighed soldier safety. It's a risk, Sarah acknowledged. But it might be our only chance to get this evidence in front of people who can actually do something about it. The decision to approach Colonel Torres represented a point of no return. Once they handed over their evidence, they would lose control of how it was used and presented. They would be trusting the institutional system that had already failed them once to do the right thing with the information they had gathered. As Sarah prepared for what might be their final meeting with Torres, she reflected on how much had changed since Rodriguez's first phone call. What had started as a simple request for advice had evolved into a comprehensive challenge to policies that were putting soldiers at risk. She had gone from being a branded failure to being the key figure in an investigation that could reshape how the Army approached training safety. But success was far from guaranteed. Williams had demonstrated his political skills by building a reputation as an effective leader despite evidence to the contrary. The institutional forces that had supported his rise to command were not likely to abandon him easily, especially not based on criticism from people he had already marginalized. Sarah understood that the next few days would determine not just the fate of her investigation, but the future safety of soldiers who deserved better than policies that prioritized politics over their welfare. The branded failure was about to discover whether the system that had cast her out was capable of admitting its mistakes. The meeting with Colonel Torres was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 0800 hours in her office at the base medical facility. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in her car in the parking lot as she rehearsed the presentation she had prepared. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. After months of investigation and preparation, everything would depend on whether she could convince a senior officer she had never met that the evidence justified risking careers and reputations. Harrison had arranged the meeting by telling Torres that he had compiled concerning data about training injuries and wanted to present it formally through proper channels. He hadn't mentioned Sarah's involvement, wanting to give Torres a chance to review the evidence before learning about the unconventional source of some of the analysis. When Sarah finally entered the medical facility, she was struck by the familiar sights and sounds of military bureaucracy, the smell of industrial disinfectant, the sound of keyboards clicking in administrative offices, the sight of earnest young soldiers filling out forms they didn't quite understand. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia for the world she had been forced to leave. Colonel Torres' office was spartanly decorated with medical certificates, unit citations, and a single family photo showing her with 2 teenage children. Torres herself was a compact woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and the direct gaze of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. Dr. Harrison tells me you have some concerning data about training injuries, Torres said without preamble after Sarah and Harrison had taken seats across from her desk. I should tell you up front that I'm already aware of the recent incidents and am conducting my own review of training protocols. Sarah exchanged a glance with Harrison, who had clearly not expected Torres to reveal her own concerns so readily. This could work in their favor. If Torres was already questioning Williams' methods, she might be more receptive to evidence that supported her own observations. Colonel, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Sarah began. We have compiled comprehensive data that suggests the recent training injuries are not isolated incidents, but rather predictable results of systematic policy changes that have eliminated proven safety measures. Torres' expression sharpened. Go on. Sarah opened her laptop and began presenting the evidence they had so carefully compiled. She started with the statistical analysis showing the correlation between Williams' policy changes and increased injury rates, then moved through the specific medical cases that demonstrated violations of established safety protocols. As she spoke, Sarah watched Torres' expression change from polite interest to serious concern. The colonel interrupted frequently to ask detailed questions about methodology, data sources, and medical protocols. Her questions were sharp and probing, but they revealed a growing alarm about what the evidence suggested. These hydration protocols, Torres said, pointing to one of Sarah's charts. Who developed the original standards you're comparing against? This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. I did, ma'am, during my service with this unit from 2016 to 2019. Torres looked up sharply. Your former military? Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Sarah Martinez, discharged in February 2019. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Torres' expression became guarded, and Sarah could see her reassessing everything she had just heard through the lens of this new information. Dr. Harrison, Torres said slowly, you didn't mention that your evidence was compiled by a former member of the unit in question. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Colonel, I thought the evidence should speak for itself regardless of the source. The data is objective and verifiable. Torres studied Sarah for a long moment. Ms. Martinez, what were the circumstances of your discharge? Sarah had prepared for this question, but it was still difficult to answer. Administrative discharge for failure to adapt to military standards. I was deemed unsuitable for continued service due to repeated instances of questioning superior officers and failure to conform to established command structures. In other words, Torres said bluntly, you were discharged for insubordination. That was the official characterization, yes, ma'am. Torres leaned back in her chair, and Sarah could see her weighing what she had learned. The evidence was compelling, but it was coming from someone who had been officially deemed a problem soldier. From Torres' perspective, this could be an elaborate attempt at vindication by someone with an axe to grind against her former unit. Ms. Martinez, help me understand something. If your training protocols were so effective, why were you discharged instead of promoted? Why weren't your methods adopted more widely? The question cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong during Sarah's military career. She chose her words carefully, knowing that Torres was looking for signs of bitterness or personal agenda. Colonel, I believe I was discharged because I prioritized soldier welfare over institutional convenience. The methods I developed were effective, but required more individualized attention and more complex implementation than some leaders wanted to invest in. When I continued to advocate for these approaches despite resistance from my chain of command, I was labeled as a troublemaker. And now you're back, trying to prove that your way was better all along. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the implication, but forced herself to remain calm. Colonel, I'm back because 3 soldiers are in the hospital, and more are going to get hurt if the current policies continue. If proving that my methods were better serves to protect those soldiers, then, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Torres was silent for several minutes, studying the evidence Sarah had presented while clearly wrestling with the implications of its source. Finally, she spoke. Ms. Martinez, this data is troubling, regardless of who compiled it. But I need to understand your motivations before I can decide what to do with it. Are you seeking vindication for your discharge, or are you genuinely concerned about soldier safety? It was a fair question, and Sarah had asked herself the same thing many times during the investigation. Colonel, I won't pretend that vindication wouldn't feel good. I was branded a failure and pushed out of the military for raising the same kinds of concerns that are documented in this evidence. But my primary motivation is preventing unnecessary injuries and deaths. How can I be sure of that? Sarah leaned forward, meeting Torres' gaze directly. Because I'm risking my civilian career and my reputation to be here. I've already been branded a failure once. Coming forward with this evidence means I'll be branded a troublemaker as well. If this was about personal vindication, there are easier ways to achieve that. Torres turned to Harrison. Doctor, what's your assessment of Ms. Martinez's motivations? Harrison straightened in his chair. Colonel, I've worked with Ms. Martinez on this investigation for 3 months. She has consistently focused on soldier safety rather than personal grievances. Her analysis has been objective and thorough, and she has repeatedly cautioned against letting personal feelings influence the evidence. Torres nodded slowly, then picked up the phone on her desk. I'm going to need to make some calls before I can proceed with this. I need to verify some of this data independently and consult with other medical officers about the protocols in question. Sarah felt her heart sink. Delays would give Williams time to prepare his defenses and possibly retaliate against their sources. Colonel, we understand the need for verification, but we're concerned that Major Williams may already be aware of our investigation. Any delay could result in evidence being altered or sources being intimidated. Ms. Martinez, I appreciate your concerns, but I cannot base official action on unverified data from disputed sources. If this evidence is as compelling as you suggest, it will stand up to scrutiny. The meeting ended with no firm commitments, leaving Sarah and Harrison to wonder whether they had made progress or simply exposed themselves to retaliation without gaining anything in return. As they left the medical facility, Sarah felt the familiar frustration of dealing with institutional caution in the face of urgent problems. Their concerns about Williams' response proved justified. Within 48 hours, Rodriguez called with alarming news. Sarah, Williams has accelerated his timeline for implementing new training protocols. He's announced that all units will transition to what he's calling enhanced readiness standards within 2 weeks. Sarah felt sick. What does that mean specifically? Longer training days, more intensive physical requirements, and elimination of what he calls unnecessary safety buffers. He's basically institutionalizing all the policies that put those 3 soldiers in the hospital. The news galvanized Sarah into action. Williams was clearly trying to create facts on the ground before any investigation could stop him. If his enhanced protocols were implemented, reversing them would be much more difficult than preventing them in the first place. Sarah called an emergency meeting with Harrison, Santos, and Park. They gathered at the same restaurant where they had been meeting, but the mood was markedly different. The time for careful preparation was over. They needed to act immediately or watch Williams cement policies that would put countless soldiers at risk. We need to force Torres' hand, Sarah announced. Williams is moving too fast for normal bureaucratic processes to stop him. How? Park asked. Torres made it clear that she needs time to verify our evidence. Sarah had been thinking about this problem since leaving Torres' office. We need to make this public. If internal channels won't act quickly enough, we need external pressure to force action. Harrison looked alarmed. Sarah, going public means ending all our military careers. Once we're labeled as people who leaked sensitive information to the media, we'll never work in the defense sector again. Maybe, Sarah agreed. But if we don't act, more soldiers are going to get hurt. At some point, you have to decide what's more important, your career or your conscience. The group debated through the evening, weighing the potential consequences of going public against the certainty that Williams' enhanced protocols would put soldiers at unnecessary risk. Santos finally broke the deadlock. I became a medic to help people, not to protect my career, she said. If going public is what it takes to prevent unnecessary injuries, then that's what we have to do. Park nodded reluctantly. She's right. We've gathered all this evidence. If we don't use it, what was the point? Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Then, we're agreed. We take this public. The question was how to do it effectively. Simply contacting local media wouldn't guarantee that the story would be taken seriously or presented accurately. They needed to find a journalist who understood military issues and would take the time to verify their claims rather than simply sensationalizing the conflict. Harrison suggested contacting Rebecca Walsh, a defense correspondent for the Washington Tribune who had written extensively about military training and safety issues. Walsh had a reputation for thorough reporting and was respected by both military officials and critics. Sarah spent 2 days preparing a comprehensive briefing packet for Walsh, including summaries of their evidence, detailed explanations of the safety protocols in question, and documentation of the correlation between policy changes and increased injuries. She also prepared herself for what would likely be the most important interview of her life. The call with Walsh was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Sarah sat in her apartment, surrounded by months of research and evidence, as she dialed the number Harrison had provided. Ms. Walsh, this is Sarah Martinez. Dr. Harrison from Fort Carson told you I would be calling? Yes, he mentioned you had some concerns about training policies that might be putting soldiers at risk. Can you give me an overview of what you're alleging? Sarah took a deep breath and began explaining the situation. Williams' systematic dismantling of safety protocols, the resulting increase in injuries, the institutional resistance to addressing the problems. She was careful to stick to facts and avoid inflammatory language, knowing that any hint of personal agenda would undermine her credibility. Walsh asked probing questions throughout the conversation, clearly testing Sarah's knowledge and motivations. Ms. Martinez, I understand you were discharged from the military. How do I know this isn't simply an attempt to get back at officers who ended your career? It was the same question Torres had asked, and Sarah gave the same answer. Because the evidence speaks for itself. I'm providing you with documented proof that specific policy changes have resulted in preventable injuries. You can verify everything I'm telling you independently. What kind of evidence? Sarah outlined the statistical analysis, the medical documentation, the testimony from current and former personnel. She could hear Walsh taking notes throughout the conversation. This sounds serious, Walsh said finally. But I'll need to verify your claims before I can write anything. Can you provide me with contact information for sources who can corroborate your evidence? Sarah had prepared for this request, but it still made her nervous. Providing sources meant exposing Santos, Park, and others to potential retaliation. But it was also necessary if the story was going to be credible. I can provide some contacts, but I need your assurance that their identities will be protected unless they specifically agree to be quoted publicly. Understood. I'll need at least 48 hours to check your facts and contact other sources. If your allegations are accurate, this could be a significant story. After hanging up, Sarah felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Within days, the investigation that had consumed months of her life would either be vindicated or destroyed in public view. Williams would learn exactly who was behind the accusations against him, and the Army would be forced to choose between defending a rising star and admitting that serious mistakes had been made. Sarah spent the weekend trying to distract herself with normal activities, but her mind kept returning to the potential consequences of her decision. If Walsh's story was taken seriously, it could force changes that would protect countless soldiers. But if it was dismissed as the complaints of disgruntled former personnel, it could discredit everyone who had risked their careers to expose the problems. On Monday morning, Sarah's phone rang before she had even left for work. It was Walsh. Ms. Martinez, I've spent the weekend verifying your claims. I need to ask you one more question before I proceed with this story. Sarah held her breath. Are you prepared for the consequences of going public with these allegations? Because once this story breaks, there's no going back. Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., her hands shaking slightly as she prepared for what would either be the vindication of everything she had fought for or the final destruction of any hope for redemption. Rebecca Walsh's story was scheduled to publish online at 6 a.m., with the print edition hitting newsstands across the country by 7 a.m. In 30 minutes, the investigation that had consumed her life for the past 6 months would become public knowledge. She had barely slept since Walsh's final call the previous evening, when the reporter had confirmed that the story would run with the headline, "Discharge Soldier Exposes Dangerous Training Policies That Hospitalized 3 Troops." Walsh had been thorough in her investigation, independently verifying Sarah's statistical analysis, interviewing current and former personnel, and obtaining comment from both Colonel Torres and Major Williams. Williams' response had been predictably aggressive. According to Walsh, he had characterized the allegations as false and malicious attacks by disgruntled former personnel seeking to undermine unit readiness and damage the reputation of dedicated soldiers. He had specifically named Sarah as someone whose discharge for failure to adapt to military standards made her an unreliable source for any criticism of Army policies. But Walsh had also obtained comment from Colonel Torres, who had confirmed that the base medical office was conducting its own review of training policies in response to the recent. More importantly, Torres had acknowledged that some of the safety protocols identified in Sarah's analysis were indeed supported by current military medical guidance. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Harrison. "Story is live. Brace yourself." She opened her laptop and navigated to the Washington Tribune's website. The story was prominently featured on the homepage, complete with photos of Fort Carson and graphics illustrating the increase in training injuries. As she read through Walsh's careful reporting, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror. The journalist had presented their evidence clearly and objectively, but she had also included enough detail about Sarah's background to make her a target for retaliation. The immediate response was overwhelming. Sarah's phone began ringing continuously as other media outlets sought follow-up interviews. Her email inbox filled with messages from veterans organizations, military families, and current service members expressing support for her decision to speak out. But there were also angry messages from people who viewed her as a traitor and a troublemaker. The most difficult call came from her former warehouse supervisor, Jim Walsh, who had clearly read the story and was furious about the negative publicity it might bring to his operation. "Martinez, I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't have troublemakers working here, he said when Sarah answered her phone. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Sarah had expected this outcome, but it still stung. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from anonymity to notoriety, losing her job and exposing herself to nationwide scrutiny. She tried to remind herself that the purpose had been to protect soldiers, not to advance her own interests, but the immediate consequences were sobering. The reaction from Fort Carson was swift and predictable. By 10 a.m., the base had issued a statement defending its training protocols and characterizing the allegations as unsubstantiated claims from individuals with personal grievances against current leadership. Major Williams was quoted as expressing confidence that any official investigation would vindicate his policies and demonstrate the professional excellence of his command. But the story had momentum that official denials couldn't stop. By noon, Sarah was fielding calls from congressional staffers whose bosses served on the House Armed Services Committee. By evening, 3 different veterans organizations had issued statements calling for a formal investigation of the training policies at Fort Carson. The breakthrough came on Wednesday, when Congressman Michael Torres, no relation to Colonel Torres, announced that his subcommittee on military personnel would hold hearings on training safety protocols within 30 days. Torres, a former Marine who had built his political career on military issues, described the allegations as serious enough to warrant immediate congressional attention. Sarah watched the congressman's press conference from her apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and apprehension. She had wanted accountability, but congressional hearings meant that every aspect of her military service and subsequent discharge would be subjected to public scrutiny. Her decision to speak out would be examined by people whose political futures depended on their ability to identify and exploit any weaknesses in her credibility. The call from Colonel Torres came Thursday morning, surprising Sarah with its directness and lack of hostility. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that my independent review has confirmed several of your key allegations, Torres said without preamble. The correlation between policy changes and increased injury rates is statistically significant and medically concerning. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Colonel, does this mean you'll be taking action to address the policies? I've already submitted my findings to the base commander with recommendations for immediate modifications to current training protocols. I've also requested a formal investigation of Major Williams' implementation of enhanced readiness standards. It was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. A senior medical officer with impeccable credentials was essentially validating the evidence that had cost Sarah her military career to compile. Colonel, I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to look at the evidence objectively. Torres was quiet for a moment before responding. Ms. Martinez, I want to ask you something. Given what this investigation has cost you personally, do you regret your decision to speak out? Sarah considered the question carefully. She had lost her job, exposed herself to public criticism, and burned any remaining bridges to the military community. But she had also forced attention on policies that were genuinely dangerous and potentially saved countless soldiers from unnecessary injury. No, ma'am, I don't regret it. The real vindication came the following week, when the base commander announced that Major Williams was being reassigned pending a formal investigation of his training policies. The enhanced readiness standards that had been scheduled for implementation were suspended indefinitely, and several of Williams' key policy changes were immediately reversed. Even more significantly, the base announced that it was conducting a comprehensive review of all training protocols with input from medical personnel, logistics specialists, and experienced NCOs. The announcement specifically mentioned the importance of balancing operational readiness with soldier safety, language that directly echoed Sarah's original approach to training development. Rodriguez called that evening with news that made the institutional changes personal. Sarah, you need to know what's happening here. Williams is gone, transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon. The new commanding officer has asked for copies of all your original training protocols. And the 3 soldiers who were hospitalized? Martinez is awake and asking about the soldier who developed the safety standards that could have prevented his injuries. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. After months of being treated as a failure and a troublemaker, people were finally acknowledging that her work had value, that her concerns had been legitimate. Rodriguez, do you think this will actually change anything long-term? Or will they just wait for the attention to die down and go back to business as usual? Honestly, I think it depends on whether people like you keep speaking up when you see problems. The system only changes when people are willing to pay the price to force it to change. The congressional hearings took place 6 weeks after Walsh's initial story, in a packed committee room where Sarah found herself seated at a witness table facing a panel of representatives whose questions ranged from genuinely concerned to openly hostile. She had prepared extensively with the help of a veterans advocacy organization, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the intensity of being questioned under oath about every decision she had made during her military career. Congressman Michael Torres proved to be a fair but demanding questioner, clearly determined to establish the facts without regard to political considerations. Ms. Martinez, help the committee understand something. If your training protocols were as effective as you claim, why did your superiors choose to discharge you rather than promote you? Sarah had been asked variations of this question dozens of times, but answering it under oath in front of television cameras felt different. Congressman, I believe I was discharged because I prioritized soldier welfare over institutional convenience. My methods required more time, more individualized attention, and more complex implementation than some leaders were willing to invest in. When I continued to advocate for these approaches despite resistance, I was labeled as someone who couldn't adapt to military standards. Are you suggesting that the military discharged you for being too concerned about soldier safety? I'm suggesting that institutional cultures sometimes punish people for raising inconvenient truths, even when those truths could prevent unnecessary casualties. The most powerful moment of the hearings came when Private Martinez, the young soldier who had nearly died during the training exercise, was called to testify. Still weak from his ordeal but determined to speak, he described the conditions that had led to his hospitalization and the complete absence of the safety protocols that might have prevented it. Sir, we knew something was wrong, he told the committee. We were dropping from heat exhaustion in weather that shouldn't have been dangerous. But when anyone suggested slowing down or taking water breaks, they were told they were showing weakness. When asked if he was aware of the safety protocols that Sarah had developed, Martinez's answer was unequivocal. Sir, if those protocols had been in place, I wouldn't have spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Neither would my buddies. The committee's final report, issued 3 months later, was a comprehensive vindication of Sarah's concerns and a scathing indictment of the institutional failures that had allowed dangerous policies to be implemented. The report specifically recommended that Sarah's original training protocols be adopted as a model for other units, and that the Army implement systemic changes to ensure that safety concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. But the most meaningful vindication came in a private ceremony at Fort Carson, where the new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reeves, presented Sarah with a commendation for her contribution to soldier safety and training excellence. Sergeant Martinez, Reeves said as she pinned the medal on Sarah's civilian blazer, this commendation recognizes not just your technical expertise, but your moral courage. You spoke up when it mattered, even when it cost you personally. Standing in the same building where she had been processed for discharge 2 years earlier, Sarah felt the weight of vindication and redemption. She was no longer the branded failure who had been cast out for being too difficult to manage. She was a recognized expert whose work had saved lives and improved military training standards. The transformation in how she was perceived was remarkable. Military personnel who had shunned her during her final months of service now sought her advice on training and safety issues. Veterans organizations invited her to speak at conferences. Civilian employers who had once questioned her military discharge now viewed her as someone with the integrity and expertise to stand up for what was right regardless of personal cost. Sarah eventually found work with a consulting firm that specialized in organizational safety and training development. Her unique combination of military experience and proven willingness to challenge dangerous practices made her valuable to clients who needed honest assessments of their policies and procedures. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the message she received from Private Martinez 6 months after the congressional hearings. Ma'am, I wanted you to know that I'm back on full duty and doing well. More importantly, I wanted to thank you for caring enough to fight for soldiers you'd never met. The new training protocols are tough, but fair, and everyone knows they're designed to make us better soldiers while keeping us safe. You gave me my career back, and you probably saved my life. Sarah kept that message framed on her desk as a reminder of why she had been willing to sacrifice her own career to speak out about dangerous policies. She had been branded a failure by people who confused conformity with competence, but she had ultimately proven that true leadership meant putting principles above personal advancement. The story of her discharge and subsequent vindication became a case study in military leadership courses, used to illustrate the importance of moral courage and the dangers of institutional cultures that punish dissent. Sarah was occasionally invited to speak to military audiences about the balance between loyalty and integrity, though she always emphasized that her goal had never been to attack the institution she had served. "The military taught me that leadership means taking care of your people," she would tell these audiences. "Sometimes that means protecting them from policies that put them at unnecessary risk, even when challenging those policies comes at personal cost." 2 years after the congressional hearings, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the Army Personnel Command. The caller, a colonel she didn't recognize, had a surprising proposition. "Ms. Martinez, the Army is conducting a comprehensive review of training policies and safety protocols. We're looking for experienced professionals who understand both the technical requirements and the institutional challenges involved in implementing effective training systems. Would you be interested in returning to service in a consulting capacity?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the irony of being invited back to help with the same issues that had led to her discharge. "Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but I think I can be more effective as an outside advisor. The Army needs people who can speak honestly about problems without fear of career consequences." "I understand," the colonel replied, "but I want you to know that your work has been influential in changing how we approach these issues. The Army is better because of what you did." After hanging up, Sarah reflected on the journey that had taken her from branded failure to recognized expert. She had paid a significant price for speaking out about dangerous policies, but she had also learned that sometimes the most important victories come at great personal cost. Her old unit had been transformed under Lieutenant Colonel Reeves' leadership, adopting training protocols that balanced operational readiness with soldier safety. Injury rates had dropped to their lowest levels in 5 years, while readiness scores had actually improved as soldiers were able to train more consistently without being sidelined by preventable injuries. Major Williams had quietly retired from the Army after his reassignment, his career effectively ended by the investigation that had exposed his dangerous policies. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall. She had never wanted to destroy anyone's career, but she was relieved that his approach to training would not be inflicted on other units. The broader impact of her decision to speak out was still being felt throughout the military. Training safety had become a priority at the highest levels of command, with new policies requiring medical input on all training protocols and protection for personnel who raised safety concerns. Sarah had proven that it was possible to challenge institutional power and create positive change, even at great personal cost. She had transformed herself from a branded failure into a catalyst for reform, demonstrating that true leadership sometimes meant sacrificing personal advancement for the greater good. Standing in her office one morning, looking at the framed commendation from Fort Carson and the thank you message from Private Martinez, Sarah understood that her real military career had begun not when she enlisted, but when she chose to speak out about policies that put soldiers at risk. She had finally become the leader she had always aspired to be, someone who put principles above politics and people above personal advancement. The branded failure had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that doing the right thing was more important than doing the expedient thing. And, in saving her old unit, she had ultimately saved herself.